Hey, welcome back to the show. I feel like I keep doing this intro where I'm like exaggerating the word. Welcome back to the show, MetFlex and Chill. Okay, anyway. Today's episode is a solo recording where I am chatting all about my building phase. So basically, taking you through some top takeaways from the last 8 months. I'm going to go over some stats with my body composition, with my performance. I'm going to chat through some of the mental hurdles that I got through over the last 8 months. And then I'm going to dive into my plan for my cut that I just started 3 days ago as I'm recording this podcast, and kind of bring you through what my plan is for the next 4 months, chat through how I'm setting up my nutrition, how I'm working with my coach, my training, all that jazz. And then I'm also going to be answering some questions that I got on Instagram related to my building phase. So we'll get into those as well. And before we get started, I do want to shout out the newest project that I'm super excited about, the Muscle Science for Women program with my business partner, Ashley Van Houten. It is now live to sign up to reserve your spot. So if you're interested, definitely check out the link in the show notes, or you can go to metflexlife.com/muscle-science-women to learn more about the program, what it involves. You can check out the course curriculum. And also, if you haven't listened to the podcast episode that I released last Friday, that episode is called Muscle Science for Women, and that is where Ashley and I are diving into all the specifics of the program, why we created it, who it's for, all that jazz. So I will link the link in the show notes to the program page, and I will also link last week's podcast for you to check out. All right, let's jump into this episode, chatting all about my building phase, my plan for my next fat loss phase, and answering all of your questions. All right, so let's dive into some stats from the last 8 months in regards to my body composition and my weight. So I started the building phase beginning to mid-July. I think it was like July 10th or somewhere around there. And I was around like 130, 131 pounds. I just finished a period of maintenance, a short period of maintenance where I was just kind of hanging out at maintenance for, I think it was about a month, from the end of May through June to beginning of July. I had finished a previous cut at the end of May. So I was hanging out around 130, 131 pounds, which is on the leaner side for me. That's really probably like my, I guess, like floor, you could call it, of where I feel super lean, but also pretty manageable in the sense of like I could maintain that if I tried really hard. But I feel like generally at least from the last like 2 years, I'm probably most comfortable around like 135-ish. So, and I mean, the scale is not the end all be all, but just from using the scale as kind of a gauge of stats for myself, I can do that just based off knowing, how it's changed over the last 3 or so years since I started working with my coach, went through my initial transformation. So anyway, started around 130, 131 pounds beginning of July. And right now, as I'm recording this podcast, I just started my cut like a few days ago, but I started the cut I ended the building phase, let's say it that way. I ended my building phase at about 145 pounds, so kind of fluctuating between 144 and 146. So we'll just take 145 as the middle ground. So this is, right now we're in March, beginning of March 2021. I started the building phase in July 2020, so that's about 8 months. And I also so it's been 8 months of building, but within that 8-month period, if you're not aware, I did a mini cut, and I actually recorded 2 podcasts all about the mini cut that I did back in December of 2020. So I was July, August, September, October, November. So I was about 5 months into the building phase, did a mini cut, mostly because I've never done a mini cut before. I wanted to put myself through it just to experience it. And if you have no idea what a mini cut is, definitely check out the episodes that I recorded previously. So I recorded an episode at the beginning of the mini cut, and then I recorded an episode with my results and reviewing the mini cut. So I will link those in the show notes. They are episode 76 and episode 86. So if you haven't listened to those yet, you can definitely check those out, where I chat all about how it went, all that jazz. So I'm not going to dive into that today, but definitely check those out if you're interested. So yeah, so I did a mini cut in December, and so that basically takes out about 3 weeks. I did it for 3 weeks, and I did drop about 3 to 3.5 pounds during that time. So I guess the building phase, if we take out those 3 weeks, is about 7 months and a week or so. And within the building phase, my goal at the start of it was to gain between 0.25 and 0.5% of my body weight per week, or that came out to about 0.3 to 0.7 pounds per week. So that was the goal, to kind of stick within that range. And this didn't happen every week. Like every week I didn't gain exactly, 0.3 pounds. Doesn't really work like that, but having kind of numbers to shoot for on a weekly basis can allow you to kind of extrapolate that out to like a month-long period. So you can kind of use the weeks to obviously calculate to what it would look like for a month period. So with each month, the goal was to gain about 1 to 2% of my body weight, which came out to about 1.3 to 2.6 pounds per month. So again, with these numbers, these are just kind of ranges to be aware of, in the sense of, like I mentioned, it's not always just like, and it's the same with the fat loss phase. If we aim to lose a certain amount of weight every week in a fat loss phase, it's never going to happen like that. You're never going to lose X amount of pounds every single week, but we use that range and that gauge to kind of keep us on track. And then when we look like a month down the line and do the math backwards, we should see that on average we're either, gaining or losing the amount that we kind of anticipated. On the other side of that too, it's not always about the scale, especially in a fat loss phase. I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but it's not always about the scale, because we know, especially in a fat loss phase, there's so many other ways to track progress, and some people don't even see changes on the scale. So we're also obviously looking at measurements and progress pictures and how you're feeling, all that jazz. I also looked at that in my building phase. But with the building phase, I feel like the scale is more of a, more of a good gauge of how things are going versus a fat loss phase, because with a building phase, we do want to see the scale go up, right? Because when we're looking to build muscle weighs something, right? So if we're actively trying to build muscle and we're not seeing the scale go up, then we're probably not doing what we need to be doing. And this is in the sense of when we're in a building phase, not like when we're trying to, body recomp or anything like that, which is a different subject. I've recorded podcasts on that in the past, which I'll link some of those in the show notes too if you haven't listened to those. But with the goal of building, you want to see the scale go up, especially if you're someone who is like more advanced and you are specifically wanting to push that weight up so that you can build an optimal amount of build muscle in the most optimal way, right? So we know in a building phase, we want to see the scale go up. So basically kind of looking back at my stats, if I went from 131 back in July to about 145 right now, that's 15 pounds in 8 months, which is kind of crazy to look back on. But that comes out to about I did the math and I have my notes here. That comes out to about 1.9 pounds per month. And if we kind of extrapolate that, 1 to 2% of my body weight per month, and I gained, which would have been between 1.3 and 2.6 pounds per month. So I gained about 1.9 pounds per month. So right in that middle range of where I wanted to be, a little bit more on the upper side of that. Well, actually, no, middle range. So I was right on track there, but I guess it is on the upper side, because if we do take into account the mini cut, which makes things a little bit more complicated, so I'm not going to get into all that. But with the mini cut, like I said, it was 3 weeks, and I did drop. I was pretty aggressive with the mini cut, dropped about 3.5 pounds. So if we extrapolate that out, then it comes to probably around like 2.8 pounds per month or something like that. So right in the upper range of that 1 to 2% body weight per month. So I was really, at the end of the day or at the end of the 8 months, kind of came out on target for what my goal was. And this is important, I think, especially in a building phase, to have a target rate of gain, because I feel like it's really easy to kind of just get into a building phase and be like, all right, I'm just gonna, eat as much as I want, and I'm building muscle, so I can just, whatever, eat what I want. And it really doesn't work like that, because with a building phase, it can be easy to put on a lot more body fat than you need to. And we know that when you're building muscle, there's going to be a little bit of body fat that comes along for the ride. That's just kind of how it works. It's pretty impossible to go into, maybe there's some genetic freaks out there, but for most people, it's impossible to not gain a little bit of body fat as you're gaining muscle. So that's just something to think about, like having a rate of gain is important. And also, I worked with my coach every single week. He kind of kept me on track with this, and I'll dive into that in a little bit. But that was in terms of my body composition. So basically up 15 pounds, and now it's time to go into a fat loss phase and kind of unveil all of the hard work I've put in over the last 8 months, drop some body fat. Hopefully within those 15 pounds, there's a good amount of muscle that I've built there. So the goal is to basically drop body fat without losing muscle, which is the goal of any diet, I think. And I'm going to chat about how I'm going to go about that in a second. But in terms of my performance stats, so those were my body composition stats over the building phase. In terms of performance stats, I did hit lots of PRs during this building phase. I continue to go up in my lifts, maybe not every single week, but on a bi-weekly or tri-weekly basis, my lifts continue to go up. I'm going to talk about my training split in a bit, because someone actually asked me, what my training was like. So I don't want to dive into that quite yet. I'm going to address that in one of the questions in a little bit. So performance-wise, it was amazing. I felt so good in the gym for the majority of the time, and it was great. So eating more, fueling appropriately, it's amazing how that can affect your time in the gym and just feeling super strong. So that was performance stats. Again, I'll go into a little bit more of that in a second. And then in terms of like the mental side of things, so with like nutrition, well, I'll dive into the nutrition a little bit. So in terms of what my nutrition looks like over the last 8 months, I'm not going to go into my like specific macros and calories and all that, but basically I am a person who loves protein. So I kept protein pretty high. Especially, working with my coach, we kept protein around like, I believe it's like 1.2 grams per pound of body weight, around that. That wasn't like every single day and every single week, but I would say between like that 1 and 1.3 grams per pound of body weight is where my protein was. Again, I love eating protein, so I like to keep it on the higher end. In terms of the amount of food I ate, so I love to eat, so that wasn't an issue for me. It was a nice change to actually, I feel like it's been a while since it's actually been the first time since I've actually actively eaten more on purpose. And that's why I really wanted to go through this building phase to kind of experience that. So that was awesome. And in terms of like my carbs and my fat, so I kept carbs, the highest that I have in a long time for this extended period of time for my building phase, just because I wanted to push as much performance and recovery as possible. And I knew that for me, carbs aid in that. So I kept carbs on the higher side. And there were some times where I incorporated, like I didn't stick to just super, super high carb, but I incorporated some days where carbs were lower, fats were higher, mostly on some of my like during some of my deload weeks, some of my, off days, just because I don't necessarily need higher carbs on those days. So yeah, that's kind of how my nutrition was. Again, I'm not going to dive into all the specifics, but that's kind of the general of that. And then in terms of like the mental side of things, like I was saying, it was hard. Seeing the scale go up is definitely not easy. I feel like for any woman or anybody in general, not even just women, that, watching that scale number go up week after week, it's mentally something that is not easy to deal with. But I knew that I was doing it on purpose, right? I worked with my coach every single week, checked in with him every week, and like he helped me with the mental side of things and definitely kept me on track with, reminding me basically every single week that I was doing this on purpose. Not every single week, but every few weeks as I would get in my head sometimes, he would remind me, okay, like you're right on track for where you need to be. We're doing this for a reason, all that jazz. And that really helped. I know that, if I didn't have a coach along with me during this journey, like I probably or definitely wouldn't have been able to stick with it on my own, just from like a mental side of things, not even just the training and nutrition side of things, but that mental side. So I think, during I would say during the first like 6 months, it was, pretty smooth sailing. Again, it was hard to see the scale go up, but I didn't feel like super uncomfortable. Obviously I was gaining a little bit of body fat, so that was a little bit uncomfortable, but I would say like the most uncomfortable time has probably been the last 2 months, or the last month and a half has been the toughest. I've just kind of gotten to this point again, like up, over 10 pounds by like the last, 2 months, gotten to a point where I just feel like a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit more uncomfortable in my own skin, getting a little bit extra fluffy, just not loving what I see in the mirror, just kind of all those things that we deal with in terms of, how we see ourselves on a daily basis when we look in the mirror and maybe not being as happy with our physique as we could be, in the sense of like, I know I'm doing this for a reason, but it's hard, right? It's hard to see the extra body fat. It's hard to feel fluffy and uncomfortable even in your clothes. And so I think the last month and a half has been the hardest for me, because I was getting back to, and I am at that point where I'm just like kind of, all right, this is the time where, or this is the weight that I'm kind of tapped out at, in the sense of I don't think that I would want to go any higher than this or gain any more body fat, because I would just feel super, super uncomfortable at that point. So again, a building phase, you have to get uncomfortable. Well, really with anything, you have to get uncomfortable to grow. But I think, you get to a point where you're like, all right, I think this is enough for now. So that's the point that I got to. And, some other things that occurred in the last month and a half has been like my desire to train has gone down a little bit. Like I haven't felt as, disciplined and to go to the gym and motivated, although I don't try to rely on motivation to go to the gym, because we know that motivation ebbs and flows day to day. So you really shouldn't rely on motivation for anything really when it comes to nutrition and training. But I just have felt a little bit less of a desire to train over the last month and a half. And I was also just kind of feeling stagnant. Like I was just getting kind of bored of what I was doing, and I wanted a new goal, right? So that's another thing. Like once you get to a point where you've been kind of working towards the same thing for like 8 months, it gets to the point where like, all right, I'm kind of over this. I kind of want like something new and exciting to work towards. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? So all of these things were kind of signs that I need to switch gears. And even before this kind of happened, I did have like a periodization plan. So I was, I did talk with my coach even before we started the building phase. It was like, all right, we're going to stick in this phase for 6 to 8 months, see how it goes, and then, go into a cut to unveil everything. And it just happened to work out that, I made it to that 8 months, and now it's time to jump into a fat loss phase. So anyway, that was just some of this kind of the stats that I wanted to share about how the building phase went. There's probably some things I'm forgetting that I'll bring up in another podcast, but that's kind of the gist of it. So let's get into the fat loss phase now and what my plan is for the cut for these next 4 months. All right, so let's chat about my plan for the cut or fat loss phase. So I started the cut a few days ago. So beginning of March 2021 is where we're at now. And I plan to shoot for a loss of about 0.5 to 0.7% of my body weight per week. Again, we're starting with the scale stats here. Like I mentioned before, the scale is not everything, especially in a fat loss phase, but it is a metric to work with. And this is a metric that I'm going to be working with my coach as, a gauge over the next 4 months, looking at the trends, extrapolating this data out, not just like week to week, but over a period of a month. But we have to have some kind of range to at least look at and be within, or try to be within, so that we know that we're on track for the amount that I'm looking to lose over the next 4 months. So usually I recommend between 0.5% and 1% of body weight per week is a good place for most people, in the sense of you can, it's something that's sustainable over the long period. If you were to go over 1% of your body weight per week, for most people, it tends to be something that's unsustainable, and something that is just a lot harder, right? It's a very, very aggressive, and it tends to be a lot harder unless you're doing something like a mini cut, where it's only a very short period of time, say 3 to 4 weeks, and you're just kind of pushing away, knowing that it's only a 3-week period. But that's another conversation. So anyway, the plan is to shoot for between 0.5 to 0.75% of my body weight per week. In terms of my nutrition and my macros, I'm going to be keeping protein pretty high, just like in my building phase, around that 1.2 to 1.3 grams per pound of body weight. That is on the higher end for most people. I do recommend, anywhere between 1 gram per pound of body weight. Unless you have a lot to lose, then you can push that down a little bit to like 0.8 grams per pound of body weight. But anywhere up to like 1.5 grams per pound of body weight, for protein, is totally fine. Obviously, 1.5 grams per pound of body weight is on the higher end. But when we're talking about fat loss and going into a cut or fat loss phase, I've talked about this so many times on the podcast, why protein is so important in a fat loss phase. Well, protein is important for anything, but especially in a fat loss phase, just because we know it's the most satiating nutrient. It has the highest thermic effect of food. It is very, very important for sustaining muscle mass and maintaining muscle mass as you're in a deficit. So there's so many benefits to protein. And for me specifically, I found that I do better with higher protein during a fat loss phase. It keeps me more full. I enjoy higher protein foods. So that's why my protein is going to be on the higher end. Right now, we're starting at around 1.2 to 1.3 grams per pound. I might bump that up even higher. Might bring it down a little bit depending on how I'm feeling. So that's kind of the range I'm going for. And then in terms of carbs and fats, I'm basically starting off with the same, ratio that I started with in my building phase, because I want to see how I feel in terms of a little bit higher carbs and a little bit lower fats for my intake. I want to see kind of what keeps me the most full, right? So during my building phase, like I mentioned, I was a little bit higher carb, a little bit lower fat, felt good with that, felt good in terms of performance and recovery. And obviously going into this fat loss phase, I still want to be pushing my performance in the gym and making sure that I'm recovering adequately. So I'm going to be taking this approach of a little bit of a higher carb approach with a little bit of lower fat intake, and seeing how that goes. Really, for me, when it comes to setting up my macros for a fat loss phase, I'm obviously keeping protein pretty high, and then I'm just gauging how I feel in terms of the foods that I'm eating, right? So sometimes there's some periods of time where I feel better on higher carbs versus higher fat. There's some periods of time where I feel better on higher fat versus higher carbs. And it really comes down to just the foods that keep me feeling the most full, the most satiated, what I'm craving, what's just making me feel good, and what I know is gonna help me to adhere to the calories that I'm consuming, right? Because obviously in a fat loss phase, you're in a deficit, so calories are dropped. And for me, what I found just going through my last fat loss phase is that keeping carbs on the higher end for me personally has been a little bit better, because I can get more volume in the sense of more veggies, more fruits, especially like around my workouts. I like to put about 50% of my carbs for the day pre and post workout. I found that really helps with performance and recovery, and that's what I recommend for a lot of my clients is, structuring your carbs so that they're around your workout so you can utilize them to the best ability, right? We know especially after a workout, carbs are important in the sense that they can aid in recovery, that, you're most insulin sensitive after your workout. So when you consume carbs, your muscles are more likely to kind of soak them all up for fuel and recovery. So anyway, that's a different tangent, but for my macros for this fat loss phase, like I mentioned, higher protein and starting off higher carb, lower fat, and going to kind of see how that goes for the first few weeks and then adjust from there. And again, this is just based off of me personally and how I know that I felt in my last fat loss phase. And so using that data to kind of help me going into this one. And then in terms of training, it's going to be staying relatively the same as in the building phase. And this is something that a lot of people kind of get confused about. They think, when you go into a fat loss phase that your training has to dramatically change. Not really. I mean, for me, in my building phase, I was training about 5 days a week, which I'm going to go into in a second because someone had a question about this. I was training between 4 and 5 times a week over that 8-month period. For this fat loss phase, I am dropping down to 4 days per week of training, but I'm also going to be incorporating some more movement in the sense of bumping my steps up a bit. So I'm not going to be introducing any formal cardio until it's actually necessary. During my building phase, I didn't do much cardio. I was really just focused on hitting a specific step goal. And I did do I had some finishers at the end of some of my workouts in the beginning where I just got my heart rate up and worked in that anaerobic energy system. But for the most part, I was really just focused on my training in the gym and making sure that I was adequately recovered from that. And with this fat loss phase, I'm really going to be going into it with the same mentality as, using cardio when I need it, or using extra cardio when I need it, and really relying mostly on my diet to basically get me into that deficit. I think that's something that's really important for people to understand. Like you don't really want to be you shouldn't be relying on cardio as kind of a big chunk of your energy expenditure, because our bodies are very, very good at adapting to cardio. So if you start doing tons of cardio right from the start in your fat loss phase, your body's going to adapt to that. And so when you get further along into your fat loss phase and you have to adjust, which you most likely will, you're not going to have that much runway to pull from because you've already started with a ton of cardio. So you want to save that cardio, that extra cardio, right? We're not talking about steps here. We're mostly talking about extra time walking on the treadmill at a certain heart rate, or extra time doing a little bit more maybe HIIT cardio or conditioning. You want to save that for when you actually really need it. And that will come for most people towards the end of the fat loss phase. So for example, if we're in a 4-month fat loss phase with most clients, that comes towards the 3-month time, right? Once we've kind of gotten calories to a place where maybe they're, a little bit on the lower end and you don't want to drop calories anymore, but you still want to, see results. So maybe we bump up cardio just a bit to kind of get that, get a little bit extra energy burn throughout the day. So anyway, that's another tangent that I don't want to go off on right now. But for me, I'm going to be really focusing on my training in the gym 4 times a week. I'll be following upper lower split. I'll be focusing on a step goal. So I'm going to bump my steps up just a bit. And that's where I'm going to be getting most of my quote unquote cardio from. And then once we kind of get deeper into the fat loss phase, I'll probably introduce some formal cardio in the sense of maybe starting with 2 sessions of 20 minutes walking on an incline on the treadmill, right? 2 sessions a week, maybe bump that up to 25 minutes, 30 minutes, then maybe bump up to 3 sessions a week towards the end. So again, you want to use cardio as a tool, and it should be implemented strategically and with a plan. So anyway, that's my training. And then in terms of the timeline for the cut, so this is about, like I mentioned, 4 months. So it's going to be 16 weeks in total. And the reason for that is I do want to take it pretty slow and steady to ensure that I can maintain as much muscle as possible, and also to be able to maintain my results easier once it's over, right? So for me specifically, when I go through, and I've done this in the past, go through a little bit more of aggressive cuts, it's a little bit harder to maintain afterwards, in the sense that it's just harder for me mentally. Once I do start to increase calories, I feel like, especially after the last cut I had, it was a little bit more aggressive, and I found myself just, I don't know, it just wasn't great afterwards. I was very, very food focused. I was, my hunger signals were kind of a little bit more out of whack than they were from my previous cut before, which was more of a sustainable approach, or more of a longer term approach. So anyway, again, that's going off on a tangent, but for this cut, it's going to be really focused on getting results within the desired, time frame, but also being able to sustain those longer term, because after my cut is over, I really just want to practice or hang out at maintenance for a while and really just focus on that before going into any other, building or fat loss phase. So taking it, pretty slow and steady for 16 weeks, but also realizing that this 16-week time period, I'm not going to be in a deficit for the entire 16 weeks. I'm going to be incorporating refeeds and diet breaks. And I already have these kind of planned with my coach based off of the timeline over these next 4 months. And I really like to, for me personally, I like to put diet breaks and diet breaks mostly around times that maybe I'm traveling or I have certain events, because I feel like it just makes the most sense, it's the most practical, and that's what I like to do with a lot of my clients as well. So I have some of my diet breaks and refeeds already set up within my periodization plan. And then as we go, we're probably going to add in a few more depending on how things are going, depending on what events or travel might come up. So again, although the fat loss phase is technically 16 weeks long, I'm probably only going to be in a deficit for about 12 weeks, because that 16 weeks includes those diet breaks and those refeeds, right? And so 12 weeks is about 3 months. And that's generally what I recommend for most clients, is like no longer than, a 16-week fat loss phase, just because anything more than that you just get burnt out for most people. But it also depends on, how much you have to lose and where you're coming from as well, and all those specific things that's specific to the person. But so that's my plan for the cut. And again, I'm working with my own coach, checking in with him on a weekly basis. He's doing my training program. And yeah, that's the plan. So we'll see how it goes. I'll keep you posted as I go. I'll probably do another podcast recording, maybe halfway through. I'm sure I'll be posting things on social media as well. So that's the plan for the cut. And then I do have a few questions that I want to get into from some of the listeners. All right, the first question: what's the mental game when you cut your calories? I can't seem to stick with it. Okay, so great question. There's a few specific things that help when you go into a fat loss phase, and a few things that you're going to want to think about. So the first is having a timeline, right? So having an end date to your fat loss phase is super important, so that you know like how long you're going to be going about this, and so that you have an end date and you're not kind of just going and going and going until you completely burn out. So I think that's one thing that's super important. And that helps really from a mental side of things too, like just having a plan, having a periodization plan for your fat loss phase and for your phases beyond that is super important. I always talk about that long-term plan and why that is very useful, especially when you're talking about the mental side of things. So having a timeline is the first thing. Within that timeline, like I said, refeeds and diet breaks, right? So this is important too. And this is something that for me, for like when I went through diet, I've been through so many different diets over my, lifetime over the last like 10, 15 years, lots of yo-yo dieting, things like that. And there was one common theme to that is when I went, there's not just one, but many mistakes, I guess you could say, that I made. Was the first mistake is not having a timeline, just kind of going until, I feel like I hit my goal, which again, I think is just a recipe for disaster, because you just don't have any end date. And the second thing was I just didn't really have any planned breaks, right? I didn't have planned refeeds, planned diet breaks where I either spent a few days bringing calories up or even just a week. Like a diet break is generally around a week of just spending time at maintenance. And so that's another thing to think about, planning refeeds and diet breaks. That can really help with the mental side of things when it comes to dieting. The next thing would just be, in general, having a plan every time you go into your week, right? Planning your meals for the week ahead of time, knowing what you're going to be eating so that you don't get into this like decision fatigue when it comes to, lunchtime on Wednesday and you're stressed with work and you're just like, oh, I don't have anything planned for today. I'm just going to eat whatever's there. So that's another thing I always talk about, planning ahead, especially with your meals. And it's not necessarily like you have to obviously I'm a fan of meal prep. If you follow me on social media, you'll see that I meal prep every Sunday. And with me, mostly my meal prep, either if I have a recipe that I want to make and I want to eat that, for lunch or dinner for the week, I have no problem eating the same thing, especially if it tastes good. So I generally choose, recipes and meals that I really, really enjoy so that I don't mind, putting them on repeat for the entire week, and then I'll switch them up for the next week. But you don't have to do that. Really, with meal planning and meal prepping, the easiest way that I've found for a lot of my clients is just having bulk protein sources available for your week, right? So maybe taking some time out on Sundays to prep some protein sources so you have those available in the fridge and you can do different things with them. So, grilling up a bunch of chicken or steaks or ground beef and maybe not seasoning them so heavily so that when you get into the week, you can use those different protein sources and make different things with them. So for example, if you cooked up, say you made a huge thing of chicken in a crock pot, right? Like just shredded chicken, just put a little bit of salt and pepper, not too many seasonings. You could turn that into so many different types of meals. You could make, you could add some sugar-free barbecue sauce to it and make, a barbecue type meal, or you could add some Mexican seasoning to it and make, or some salsa and make a Mexican burrito bowl type thing or chicken bowl type thing. There's so many different options. You can do the same with ground beef, pork, things like that. So just having a bunch of protein sources prepped, and then also in terms of vegetables and stuff, having those, ready to go. So for me, I like to have a lot of frozen veggies in the freezer because those are super easy to just throw in the microwave or the air fryer, and season them how you want. Or you can, if you are more of a fresh vegetable person, chopping up your vegetables on Sunday so that you have them ready to go in the fridge. Those are really simple ways to kind of have things ready to go for the week. So planning ahead is super important. Another thing is just knowing, another tip is knowing the foods that keep you full, right? So in a fat loss phase, we know calories are going to obviously be lower. You're going to be in a deficit. You have to be in a deficit to lose body fat. So you want to find the foods that are most satiating for you personally. You want to find foods that fill you up and just keep you full for a long period of time, right? So for me, finding higher volume foods is important. Like I said, higher protein is important for me because I know that keeps me fuller longer. Having lots of veggies, lots of volume, I like that because, again, it fills my belly up, makes me feel obviously more full for a long period of time. And then I also have hunger hacks that I usually keep on hand, especially in a fat loss phase. So there's different hunger hacks in the sense of, foods that are higher volume and very low calorie. Those can be super, super helpful. So I'm going to actually on my website, on my main homepage, metflexlife.com, if you go to that page, you'll see that there's a free hunger hack guide download. And it's basically a free recipe book that has a bunch of the hunger hacks that I personally use and that I recommend for my clients. So you can head over to my website, metflexlife.com. I'll link it in the show notes and download that free hunger hacks guide. That should help with giving you some ideas of higher volume, very low calorie snacks or desserts or things like that can help with kind of getting you through a fat loss phase. I definitely utilize a lot of those and I think they're super helpful. So That's another thing. And then another thing is utilizing different tools and strategies that fit your personal lifestyle can be very, very useful. So specifically things like calorie cycling. And with myself and with a lot of my clients, the most common ways that we use calorie cycling is either a 5-2 split where we have, lower calories during the week when you're, not super focused. For most people, you're focused on work. You're not really, most people aren't really going out to dinner every night and things like that, like you may be on the weekends when you're, enjoying a little bit more flexibility. So having a 5-2 split where you have, 5 days during the week, Monday through Friday, where calories are a little bit on the lower end, and then 2 days on the weekend, you can have calories a little bit higher. So that's splitting up your calories, and looking at it on a weekly basis rather than a day-to-day basis. I find that can be very, very helpful, especially for specific lifestyles. And there's so many different ways to calorie cycle. But that's one of the most common ways. And then also I like to incorporate for myself PSMF days. And I do this with a lot of my clients too. Those are protein sparing modified fast days. So they're basically days where you bring your calories pretty low, and you really focus just on lean protein sources. And this allows you to basically get a big chunk of your deficit out in just one day of the week. And then you can have, higher calories the other 6 days of the week. So that's a really great strategy that I found to work for a lot of my clients, and it works for me as well. Some people it might not work for, or there are definitely people that it doesn't work for if you are more sensitive to fasting. So again, these are just tools and strategies to kind of have in your back pocket and to think about using, and work with a coach if you haven't used these in the past or if you're interested in that. Also, intermittent fasting is a nice tool to use as well in a fat loss phase for some people, not all. And it's just another tool. It's not magic, but it's something to help you to maybe adhere to your specific calories a little bit easier. So for example, for me, like if I push breakfast off and I don't eat till maybe like 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock on some days, then that allows me to have a bigger meal for lunch and dinner, versus if I were to eat breakfast, then I would have, smaller meals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But I don't necessarily intermittent fast every single day. I think, again, it's a tool. It's not magic. Some people are more sensitive to intermittent fasting than others, especially like I found for myself, there's periods of time where I do really well with intermittent fasting, and there's other periods of times where I just don't. So I think that is another kind of gauge that you have to work with and kind of see how you react, but it is a good tool. So those are just a few tools in terms of tools and strategies for cycling your calories throughout the week that can make adherence a little bit easier. And that's the biggest thing, right? These things aren't magic. Carb cycling, calorie cycling, intermittent fasting, they're not magic. They're just adherence tools. Yes, there are other benefits to intermittent fasting and fasting in general, but when we're talking about fat loss specifically, they're just tools. So that's another thing to think about. Then another thing, there's a bunch of things. Another tool when it comes to the mental side of things, going into fat loss phase, is what I like to call the 80-20 rule. I'm sure you've heard this before. It's really focusing on 80% of your food throughout the day, throughout the week, should be mostly whole foods, whole nutrition foods, and I like to say either had a face at some point or have grown from the earth at some point. So about 80% of your foods should be made up of those whole foods, because those are the ones that are going to keep you most full. They're going to have the most nutrients, and then maybe the other 20% can be more of those flexible foods. So things that might not be super nutritious, right? But you do enjoy them, right? You look forward to eating them, and this can help with kind of that restrictive mindset when it comes to dieting. So instead of, going into a fat loss phase and cutting out, everything that you enjoy, maybe you have to cut out a few things, but you don't necessarily have to cut out everything, right? And so having this 80-20 rule is beneficial because it allows you to really focus on getting those nutrients in, getting those foods in that are going to be higher volume, high satiety value, high nutrient value, and still able to incorporate some maybe flexible or fun foods in that other 20%. So it's that 80-20 rule. I'm sure you've heard of it, but I found that to be very, very useful, especially in a fat loss phase, because it takes away that restrictive mindset and allows you to it basically gives you permission to include these more flexible foods in, in a way that is, it's not like, what's the word? It's not looked at as guilty, right? You're not looking at it as, okay, like I'm going to go have a cheat meal and eat all this crap that I know is not super great for me, but I really enjoy it. Okay, rather than having a cheat meal, why don't we have, a strategy in place so that you can include some of those things that you enjoy and you can still stick within your goals, right? So that's where that kind of 80-20 rule comes into play. Obviously, some people are a little bit different in the sense of I've had some clients where they're just like, I just can't have this 80-20. I have to be like 100% because if I have something, like a more flexible food or something that, like ice cream or something, then I tend to just want to eat the entire gallon of ice cream or entire carton of ice cream versus just having like one scoop. So that's where it really comes down to the individual, because there's some people who can practice what we call like that moderation and have maybe a scoop of ice cream and fit that into their goals. And there's other people who struggle a lot more with that, and they can't have that during the fat loss phase because it just triggers more and more cravings. So this is where that kind of the individuality comes into play, and you really have to kind of know yourself and know, like, if you're someone who can have more of that moderation, or if you're someone who does need to cut out specific things within a period of time, maybe not forever, but just in this period to help you adhere more. So yeah, that's the kind of 80-20 quote unquote rule that could help you in terms of the mental side of things. And then the last thing I would say is accountability. So this is huge. I mean, having someone to hold you accountable week to week to stick within the goals that you've set out for that week, especially when it comes to reducing calories, that is a huge piece of it. I know for myself, like if I didn't have a coach that I had to check into every week and kept me accountable for sticking within my ranges, then I probably wouldn't, because I just didn't have that outside kind of pressure, I guess you could say, to stick within, the goal that I set out. So accountability is huge. I always preach having a coach. If you've been struggling with this in the past, if you've been kind of spinning your wheels, you can always feel free to apply for coaching with me. I'll link that in the show notes, or you can just go to metflexlife.com/apply, or, find another coach, or find someone who can hold you accountable, for this, especially if you've been struggling in the past. So those are the things that I would say are the main kind of tools and things that I would say help with the mental side of cutting calories, is just really, thinking through, okay, what's going to make this easiest? What's going to make it easier for me to adhere to, this intake of my calories, and how can I do that in a way that works with my personal lifestyle, and that I can sustain for, not just a week, but a few weeks, right? A few months, because that's how long it's going to take to actually see results, especially in a fat loss phase. Like it definitely, takes more than a few weeks, and you kind of have to be okay with that long-term investment, right? Investing in the long term and really focusing on that long-term gratification versus instant gratification. I think that's super, super important. So again, using these strategies, knowing that these are things that you need to incorporate so that you can adhere to this on a longer term basis, rather than thinking about, oh yeah, I can adhere to this for 3 days and then I'm going to like go crazy. We don't want that, right? So hopefully those tips and tools helped. All right, the next question. If you have body fat to lose, can you just use that to get your gains while in a calorie deficit? All right, great question. So basically, the biggest thing to understand with this is that muscle tissue and fat tissue are different types of tissue. So you can't just like turn fat tissue into muscle tissue. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. I wish it did. That would be awesome. But you can build muscle in a deficit under certain circumstances, and this is what we call body recomposition. And that's when you build muscle and lose fat at the same time. And there are circumstances where this occurs. I've actually recorded a few podcasts in the past, both solo podcasts and with guests, all about body recomposition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to link those episodes in the show notes. If you haven't checked those out already, those will definitely be beneficial to listen to. But the biggest takeaway here is that you can build muscle in a deficit. You can build muscle and lose body fat, but it doesn't happen in the sense of that it's not like that fat tissue is turning into muscle tissue, because it just doesn't work like that. So again, I'll link those body recomposition episodes in the show notes so you can get a little bit more familiar with the different circumstances that like some people would be able to body recomp. And there are circumstances in terms of, who's more likely to go through body recomposition versus someone who would do better going through like specific fat loss or muscle building phases. So definitely check those out. I'll link those in the show notes. All right, last question. Can you explain your workout routine during your building phase and how often did you eat? Well, I guess that's 2 questions. So in terms of my workout routine and my training during my building phase, so it was 8 months long, and I guess I kind of went back and looked through this. So 5 out of those 8 months, I was following a 5 time per week split. So I was doing upper, lower, push, pull, lower split, which is 5 days per week. And then the rest of the building phase, which was the other 3 months, this is during my mini cut, and then a few other months throughout the last 8 months, I was just following a 4 time per week, upper, lower split. So I was kind of going back and forth between 4 times per week and 5 times per week. And I did take a deload week every 5th week of the training phase. So I would, go through 4 weeks of training, and then I would take a 5th week of deload, a 5th deload week, no matter what, training protocol, no matter what training protocol I was following. Deload weeks are super important no matter what, especially in a building phase. I actually recorded a podcast a few weeks ago talking all about the importance of recovery, importance of taking deload weeks and all that jazz. So I'll link that in the show notes if you haven't checked that one out. And then in terms of like in terms of cardio and conditioning, I already chatted about this a little bit, but during my building phase, I didn't really do any formal cardio or conditioning. I really just focused on having a step goal or hitting a step goal. And that step goal was actually probably around 8. It was like between 8 and 9K. That was just, what was sustainable for me. Some weeks it was around 7K. So that's where I got my quote unquote cardio from, was just my steps. And that's another very underrated way of getting movement in, is just focusing on steps. And I think that's something that a lot of people forget about and realize that your NEAT or your non-exercise activity thermogenesis throughout the day is super, super important for any goal, and just making sure that you're moving throughout the day. And we use steps as that way to quantify, right? We use that steps as the way to quantify that movement or that NEAT. So yeah, that's how my training looked. And what was the other question? How often did you eat? Okay, so during my building phase, I think the most important thing that I found to be more important than I thought was nutrient timing. Obviously, I knew it was important, and I thought that, it was actually more important than fat loss phase. But then I was going through it, and I was, learning from my coach and working with my coach, and realized that nutrient timing is actually more important during a building phase than any other time, because the goal within a building phase is to optimize your performance and your muscle gain as much as possible, right? So you want to make sure that you are going into your workouts, going into every single workout as much as you can, as fueled as possible, right? Feeling as good as possible so that you can perform your best. So fueling your workouts appropriately, both pre and post, is huge. And that's where nutrient timing comes into play for sure. So fueling before your workout appropriately, and then also fueling after your workouts to ensure optimal recovery. That's something that I really focused on. And also ensuring, this is something that I focus on all the time, but ensuring sufficient protein intake during the day is also super, super important during a building phase, because you want to make sure that you get enough protein feedings in throughout the day to basically spike muscle protein synthesis as often as you can. So I would say I was eating at least 4 like main protein meals. And when I say main protein meals, I mean at least 25 grams or more of protein in 4 sittings at a time, spaced throughout the day. And then obviously I had some other snacks as well, just because I love to eat. But I made sure that I was really paying attention. And I do this, throughout the rest of like my phases, whatever phase I'm in, I do obviously pay attention to these things. But I think during the building phase, it was even more important because these are like the little things that might get you those, extra few percentages of gains. And that's something that I wanted to really focus on. So fueling my workouts appropriately, fueling appropriately after my workouts, making sure I'm getting sufficient protein feedings in throughout the day. Also, like I mentioned before, consuming about 50% of my carbs around my workouts, so pre and post. That has to do with obviously fueling appropriately pre and post. So making sure that about 50% of my total carb intake for the day occurred pre and post workout. So that's another thing in terms of nutrient timing. And I think that was the main things in terms of like how often I ate in terms of nutrient timing. And then I did give myself like a little bit more freedom on the weekends, right? A little bit more flexibility on the weekends. I had more calories to work with. Obviously I was in a surplus. So, it was really the time to like, versus if I was in a fat loss phase, I'd be probably a little bit more strict. And that's just kind of how it works. You got to be more strict at certain times and certain phases, depending on what the goal is. So during the building phase, I didn't go completely off the wagon, but I gave myself a little bit more flexibility, especially on the weekends. And it was nice to kind of go out and enjoy meals. I did, I had some days where I didn't even track calories and anything, which was really nice. That was the first time that happened in probably, I don't know, 2 or 3 years. So that was a nice change. But yeah, overall, that's kind of how, that's how my workout routine was and my kind of eating schedule in terms of nutrient timing and how often I ate. So anyway, that was the last question, and I hope I answered your questions. I hope you learned some things from this episode, and I hope my experience can, help you in your experiences in the future. And if you ever, feel like you're spinning your wheels, or you're just not getting the results that you feel like you should be with all the hard work that you're putting in, there's probably some different things that can be dialed in. And that's where, that's why I had to hire my own coach, 3 years ago. And that's why I still have my coach today. And there's so many benefits to that. So if you are struggling with that, feel free to reach out. You can, email me, rachel@metflexlife.com, or check out my website. I have lots of free information on there, free blog posts, tons of different podcast episodes. You can find all of those on my website at metflexlife.com. All right, I'll talk to you next time.